She raised her hand and brought it down across my son's face before I could even process what I was watching. He was 6 years old, we were at his grandfather's funeral, and the sound of that slap moved through the room like something breaking that could never be fixed. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. I looked at my son. His small head had turned to one side from the force of it. His hand came up slowly to his cheek, and then his eyes found mine, wide, wet, completely lost, and I felt something inside me go absolutely still. Not cold. Not angry. Still, like the moment before a decision you've already made without knowing it. My name is Marcus Delaney. I'm 36 years old. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, in a house where we counted what was left in the refrigerator at the end of the week. My father grew up the same way, but somewhere along the line he became something different, a man with property, with businesses, with a last name that carried weight in certain rooms in Buckhead. He married into respectability. He built something real. And his family, his mother, his father, his sister, they never let him forget who they believed they were. And they never let me forget who they believed I wasn't. I need you to know something before I tell you the rest of this. My son, Eli, he had nothing to do with any of it. He was just a child who loved his grandfather more than almost anything in the world. And on the worst day of our lives, in a room full of people who were supposed to be family, that child became a target. This is the story of what happened next, and what my father had quietly arranged before he left. The morning of the funeral, the sky over Atlanta had that heavy, compressed look, the kind where clouds press down so low it feels like the city is being held underwater. I dressed Eli in the small, dark blazer we'd bought the week before, the one he kept tugging at the collar of because he wasn't used to wearing anything that formal. I told him Grandpa would have thought he looked sharp. He almost smiled at that. Almost. We drove out to Buckhead in silence. I kept my eyes on the highway and thought about my father specifically. I thought about the last real conversation we'd had, sitting on his back porch 3 weeks before he went into the hospital. He'd been watching Eli chase something around the yard, a dragonfly, I think, and he'd turned to me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something between pride and worry. Something unfinished. I should have asked him what he was thinking. I didn't. I thought there was more time. There never is. The burial was at a cemetery off Howell Mill Road, old trees and iron fencing and those flat Atlanta afternoons that make grief feel like a physical weight pressing on the back of your neck. The priest spoke about peace and passage and the mercy of a life fully lived. I held Eli's hand and tried to listen, tried to be present, but I kept drifting back to my father's laugh, this low, rumbling sound he made when something genuinely caught him off guard, and then snapping back to the reality of watching them lower him into the ground. Eli looked up at me at one point. His voice was barely above a breath. "Daddy, why are they putting Grandpa in there?" I felt my throat close completely. I knelt down, right there in the grass, and I held him the way you hold someone when you don't have a single adequate word. Because there aren't adequate words. There never are for that question. "Grandpa is resting now," I said. "He's not hurting anymore." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can we go home after?" I pulled him closer. "Yeah, buddy, we can go home." But we couldn't go home. Not yet. Because after the burial came the house. My father's family home sat on 3 acres in the northern part of Buckhead, a wide, formal property with a long gravel driveway and the kind of landscaping that announces old money before you've even reached the front door. I had been in that house dozens of times over the years. I had never once felt welcome in it. His mother, my grandmother, though she'd never truly claimed the title, was a woman named Loretta. Small, immaculately dressed, with a voice that could go from cordial to cutting in a single sentence. She had a gift for making you feel like a guest in a room you technically belonged in. His father, Roland, said very little but communicated contempt fluently through silence and the particular way he looked at people he'd already dismissed. His sister, my Aunt Vivian, she was the one who said the quiet parts out loud. I had spent years trying to earn something from these people. Not love exactly, just acknowledgement. The basic sense that my presence wasn't a problem to be managed. I never got it. And on the drive to that house, something in me had already stopped trying. We pulled through the gate with a line of other cars. The house was already filling up cousins, family, friends, business associates, neighbors. The kind of gathering that happens after a wealthy man dies, where grief and calculation occupy the same room, and people can't always tell which is which. Eli walked in beside me. He was quiet, but his eyes were taking everything in the way children do, cataloging details, processing in that unhurried way that sometimes looks like calm and is actually something more like courage. The living room had been arranged for the reception. White flowers on every surface, candles, and on the center table, surrounded by a wreath of white roses, a large framed photograph of my father. It was a good photo, one I'd never seen before. He was smiling the way he smiled when he wasn't performing for anyone, just genuinely happy in a moment that caught him off guard. I stopped when I saw it. My chest did something complicated. Eli saw it too. He let go of my hand slowly. I remember the exact feeling of his small fingers releasing mine, and he walked toward it. Nobody stopped him. People stepped back slightly, the way adults do around children at funerals, giving them room because they don't know what else to offer. He stood in front of the photograph for a long moment. His head was tilted slightly, and then he reached up with both hands and lifted the frame from the table. "Grandpa," he said softly, and then his hands still a little unsteady. 6-year-old hands not built for holding something that size let the frame slip. It hit the hardwood floor. The glass shattered. The sound moved through that room like a gunshot through a church. Every conversation stopped, every head turned, and in the silence that followed, Eli took a small step back, looked at the broken glass around his feet, and said, his voice shaking, barely holding together, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And then Loretta's hand came down across his face. I have replayed that moment 10,000 times since then. The way the sound registered before the image. The way my brain refused to assemble it into something coherent for a full 3 seconds. The way Eli's head turned. The way he stood there afterward, his small hand pressed to his cheek, completely silent, tears moving down his face in a way that somehow made no sound. I was across the room before I knew I was moving. I pulled him against me, turned to face her, and said, my voice very low, very careful, because something inside me understood that if I raised it, I would lose control of something I couldn't afford to lose. "Why did you do that? He is 6 years old." Loretta looked at me the way she always had. Like I was a problem she was tired of accommodating. "He is a problem," she said. "He has always been a problem." I thought I had misheard her. I actually made her repeat it with my eyes, just standing there waiting. "He ruined your father's name," she said, her voice sharper now, like she'd been waiting years to say this in a room where it would count. "Everything Thomas built, everything this family stands for, that child has been a stain on it from the moment he was born." I want to tell you that I found some perfect, eloquent response in that moment. I didn't. I stood there holding my son and felt something in my chest hollow out completely. Then Vivian stepped forward, arms crossed, chin up. The particular posture of someone who has decided they are righteous. "You were always an inconvenience, Marcus," she said. "We accepted you because Thomas asked us to. But this, today, this is exactly why we said it was a mistake." And Roland, my grandfather, a man who had shaken my hand exactly twice in my life, stepped forward with his hands behind his back and said, "You are not what this family is. You never were. And that boy is proof of it." Quiet laughter moved through the room. Not everyone, but enough. The sound of it went into me somewhere deep and stayed there. Eli pressed his face against my shoulder. "Dad," he whispered. I'm sorry I broke it." That was the moment I understood completely what my father had seen clearly enough to plan for. Because my son was apologizing. My 6-year-old boy, who had done nothing except love his grandfather and reach for a photograph of him, was standing in that room apologizing for existing in it. And not one person in that room, not one person out of the 30 or 40 gathered there, said a single word in our defense. I held him tighter. "Listen to me," I said quietly, close to his ear. "You did nothing wrong. You hear me? Not one thing. This is not your fault." But they weren't finished. They kept going the way people do when they've finally given themselves permission to say what they've always thought. The insults layered on top of each other. "Nothing. Burden. Mistake. You don't belong here. You never did." I let them talk. I stood there and I let every word land, and I felt the weight of each one. And then something happened inside me that I can only describe as a kind of clarification. The grief and the hurt and the years of trying all of it went quiet. And what was left underneath was something very simple and very cold and very focused. I straightened up. I looked at Loretta directly. "Are you finished?" I asked. The room went still. I think they expected tears. I think they expected me to plead, or argue, or storm out. The calm confused them. "Pack your things," Roland said, recovering. "Leave this house. There is nothing here for you." I looked around the room. Every face, every person who had stood there and watched a child get struck and said nothing. And I made a decision. I reached into my jacket pocket. I dialed a number. The room watched in silence, some confused, some already composing the story they'd tell later. How pathetic it was. How desperate. The call connected. "It's Marcus," I said. "I need you to come. It's time." That was all. I ended the call and looked up. Something had changed in my face. I could tell by how the room received it. Honestly, if I could go back and describe what I was feeling in that moment, it wasn't triumph. Not yet. It was more like relief. The relief of a decision already made, consequences already accepted. My father had trusted me with something. I was about to honor it. Loretta narrowed her eyes. "Who did you call?" I didn't answer. I sat down in a chair near the window, settled Eli in my lap, and waited. The whispers started almost immediately. Speculation layered on top of itself. Maybe he called a friend to help him move out. Maybe he was making a scene. Maybe this was just the final embarrassing chapter of a man who never knew his place. About 20 minutes passed. Then 40. Then the front door opened. 2 men walked in, both in dark suits. One carried a leather portfolio. The other moved through the room the way someone moves through a space they have no emotional investment in, professionally, evenly, scanning without reacting. They walked to the center of the room. "Who are you?" Roland demanded. The man with the portfolio looked at him calmly. "We represent the estate of Thomas Delaney," he said. "We are here to execute the terms of his most recent legal will and testament." Dead silence. That particular silence that happens when a room full of people all realize simultaneously that the ground beneath them might not be as solid as it was 30 seconds ago. Roland's voice went stiff. "We are already fully aware of Thomas's arrangements." The man opened his portfolio. "Then I'd ask you to listen carefully, because the arrangements you are aware of were superseded." He began reading. His voice was unhurried, professionally neutral, the voice of someone delivering information, not drama. "All real property, all business holdings, all financial accounts and investment assets." He paused, just slightly, just long enough, transferred in their entirety to his grandson, Elijah Marcus Delaney, with Marcus Delaney appointed as legal trustee and guardian of said assets until Elijah reaches the age of 25. The silence after that was different from all the others. It was the silence of something collapsing. "That is not possible." Loretta's voice had lost its certainty. For the first time in my life, she sounded uncertain. "There must be an error." "There is no error," the man said. He turned a page. "This document was executed and notarized 6 weeks before Mr. Delaney's passing. It supersedes all prior arrangements." Vivienne's face had gone the color of old paper. "We were never informed of this. You were not required to be." Roland stepped forward. His composure was cracking at the edges now. Thomas would never, he would not have done this without consulting the family. I stood up slowly. Eli stayed close against my side, his hand in mine. "He consulted me," I said. Every head in the room turned. I had not planned a speech. I want to be clear about that. What came out of me in those next minutes was not prepared. It was just the truth, finally allowed to take up space in a room it had been kept out of for years. "He knew," I said. "He knew what was happening to his business. Money was being redirected. Accounts were being accessed without his authorization. He had documentation. He had legal counsel. And he knew he had known for longer than I'd like to say that the people in this room valued what he had built more than they valued him." My aunt opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "He told me 3 weeks before he died," I continued. "We sat on his back porch and he told me everything. He said he wasn't angry. He said he was just done pretending he didn't know. And he said he needed to make sure that when he was gone, Eli would be protected. Because he knew he had watched for years, and he knew that the moment he wasn't here to absorb it, every ounce of contempt this family felt would land on that boy." I looked at Loretta, the woman who had raised her hand against my son at his grandfather's funeral. "He was right," I said. "He was right about all of it, and today you proved every last calculation he made." The quiet that came after that was enormous, not peaceful, heavy. The kind of quiet that settles over a room when everyone in it is recalibrating what they thought they knew. And then Loretta's eyes filled. Not with grief, with something more desperate than that. "Marcus." Her voice was different now, smaller. "You have to understand, we were grieving. We were not ourselves. We. You called my son garbage," I said. "You struck him. In this room. In front of all of these people." I paused. "He is 6 years old, and as of 6 weeks ago, he is also the owner of everything in this house. I want to be honest with you, what came next was not satisfying the way I'd imagined it might be, if I'd ever let myself imagine it. The begging was not triumphant to watch. It was small, and it was sad, and it was exactly what happens when people who have spent their lives confusing power with identity suddenly find themselves without either. Vivienne was crying. Roland had his hand pressed against his mouth. Loretta was saying please. She was saying family. She was saying you have to understand, over and over, like one of those phrases would eventually find the lock it fit. I stood there and I felt not anger, not satisfaction. Just tired. Deeply, truly tired. And then I said one word. Leave. No volume, no performance, just the word, landing in that room like something final. For the first time in my life, none of them had anything left to say. If you have ever been in a room where someone looked right through you, where your presence was treated as an inconvenience at best, a problem at worst, then you know something about what it costs to stay standing in that room. Not the dramatic moments. The quiet accumulation. The years of feeling slightly less than, slightly wrong, slightly out of place in spaces where you technically belonged. Most of us carry that somewhere. We just carry it quietly. What my father gave me and Eli was not just property. It was a record of being seen. He sat on that back porch and he looked at me and he said, I know exactly who you are and I know exactly who they are, and I am going to make sure the truth of that outlasts me. That is what he gave us. The rest was just paperwork. The legal process took several weeks. There were challenges, of course there were challenges, but the documentation was airtight. My father had been thorough the way careful. Patient men are thorough when they know exactly what they're protecting against. By the end of it, the house, the properties, the business holdings, all of it was in trust for Eli. I didn't stay in the Buckhead house. It didn't feel like ours yet, and maybe it never fully would. Instead, Eli and I went back to Decatur, back to the neighborhood where I grew up, and spent the next few weeks just being quiet together. Cooking dinner, watching things on television, letting him be a child again without the weight of that day pressing down on him. One evening, maybe 2 weeks after everything had settled, we were sitting on the back steps of the Decatur house watching the yard go dark. Eli had his head resting against my arm. He'd been quiet for a while. He said, Dad, why did Grandpa give me all his stuff? I thought about that for a moment. Because he loved you, I said, and because he wanted to make sure you always knew it. Eli was quiet again. Then, did he know she was going to be mean to us? The question landed somewhere tender. I put my arm around him. He had a pretty good idea, I said. Eli nodded slowly, like that made sense to him. Like 6 years old has its own particular way of accepting the things adults can't quite explain. Okay, he said. And that was that. Here is what I've sat with since then, the thing this whole experience kept returning me to. People who operate from cruelty almost always believe they are operating from strength. Loretta believed she was protecting something. Roland believed he was maintaining something. They had spent so many decades deciding who belonged and who didn't that the belief had become load-bearing, take it away, and they had nothing holding them up. The mistake most people make in those situations is trying to argue with the belief, trying to prove you belong, trying to earn the acknowledgement. I did that for years. It doesn't work, because the belief was never really about you, it's about them, about what they need to be true in order to feel secure. My father understood that. He stopped arguing with it too. He just got very quiet and very careful, and he made sure the truth was legally documented. What I'd ask you to sit with today is this. Who in your life has made you feel like you needed to earn your place in a room you already belonged in? And what would it look like to stop making that case not out of defeat, but out of clarity? You don't argue with people who have already decided what you are. You just make sure the record is accurate, and then you let time do what time does. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean this genuinely, not just as a talking point. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think my father made exactly the right call. Drop a 2 if you think there was a better way to handle this. Drop a 3 if something in this story hit close to home in a way you weren't expecting. I read every single comment. I want to know where you're coming from. And I want to know where you're watching from right now, your city, your country, what time it is there. There's something I find genuinely moving about the fact that stories like this one find people across every time zone. That a back porch in Decatur and a broken photograph frame in Buckhead can reach someone on the other side of the world who has felt some version of the same thing. If you want to be here for the next one, and I promise you, the next story carries the same weight as this one, hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means I can keep doing this the way it deserves to be done. Take care of the people who are actually yours. And if someone in your life has ever called you or someone you love nothing, just wait. Just keep building. The record has a way of correcting itself. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.